Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second artist spotlight. I'm going to try to do this shorter in 15 minutes, but it's hard because these are three of my favorite artists. So let's get started and see if I can do this. Okay, so the first artist we're looking at is Michelangelo. Michelangelo is one of our most famous Renaissance artists, and he is a member of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In real life, Michelangelo knew Leonardo. He also knew Raphael. Donatello was a little before his time, but of this group of artists, I said last week Leonardo is the most curious. Michelangelo is the most emo. Do you still say that? He's a loner. He's off by himself. He thinks people might be plotting against him, although he was famous. So sometimes they were actually plotting against him, but he's just super off the charts gifted. You might know this painting. This is a fresco done by Raphael. It's called School of Athens. And he uses different artists to stand in for Greek philosophers. And he famously has Michelangelo down near the bottom, kind of off by himself and just staring into space. Michelangelo was a sculptor, a painter, and an architect, but for this lecture, we're going to concentrate on his painting. Michelangelo is famous for one large, humongous series of paintings, and it is, do you know it? The Sistine Chapel ceiling. He painted this at the end of the 1400s. The Pope asked him to paint it. Michelangelo said, "No, I'm a sculptor." And the Pope said, "I'm sorry, did I ask? I meant you will paint it." And Michelangelo said, "Oh, that's right, I will paint it." This is a working church. This church exists in the Vatican, like in the Vatican complex in Rome. And this church is great tourist opportunity, and also used by cardinals to kind of elect a new pope once the previous pope has died. So what you need to know, though, is for 500 years, this church has been used, and there has been smoke in this church from candles, incense, all kinds of stuff going on. So in the early 2000s, this church, the ceiling looked like what was on the right. This is an actual zoomed in picture of the prophet Daniel from part of the church. But in the 2000s, the Vatican decided to clean the ceiling after 500 years. And art historians were shocked when they saw Michelangelo's color. So what was revealed was the color on the left. And no one expected to have this bright, bold, dramatic color like running through this church. Everyone thought it was like grays and browns because that's what they had literally seen for 500 years. Okay, so this is how the church looks now. And this is one of the most famous images. I'm sure you probably know it's the creation of Adam. Trying to keep this brief and not trying to keep it 15 minutes. So I'll just basically say, we have the figure of God on the right. We have Adam on the left. Again, after all, this is in the ceiling of a church, so it's going to be based on a Bible story. The creation of man is really important for like the Bible story and Christianity, but it was also really important in art. That was my cat. They're destructive. It was also really important in art. And Michelangelo is credited with coming up with this whole new way how to show this like dramatic point of the story, right? In the Bible story, we have like a clay figure being created, and then we also have like the figure of God breathing into this clay figure, but all that's kind of hard to paint. So Michelangelo came up with this idea of mainly two different figures. One guy, Adam on the left, incredibly like sculpted body, but kind of languid, kind of tired pose, touching fingers with this very active, dynamic God. And if you look closer, the figure of Adam, like this curved diagonal, is echoed by the figure of God, or Adam echoes God, either way, which has its own implications. Years later, like 20 years later, Michelangelo had another commission to do another painting, which he did not like, from another pope though, so he kind of had to, of the far wall of the same church, the Sistine Chapel. And art historians are interested in this because this is the Last Judgment, another really famous, tons of artists are going to do paintings of it. But Michelangelo's painting of the Last Judgment is seen as especially terrifying, which is so different from his earlier work. And so people try to figure out, well, why was that? What was going on? So here's proof that it's terrifying. These are close-ups of it. Okay, trying to keep this short, but still, I love Michelangelo. So Michelangelo is more famous as a sculptor. He thought of himself as a sculptor. It was like his life's work. This is the sculpture of, do you know? David, he made for the city of Florence. The city of Florence fell in love with this sculpture. They thought it was them. It was a representation of their city-state, the small city-state up against the world, which in reality, it was like one of the most powerful city-states in Italy, but we never think of ourselves as powerful, right? So when Michelangelo did this sculpture, everyone was like, how'd you do that? That's amazing. And he said, it's simple. I looked at the block of marble and I removed anything that wasn't David, which sounds like a jerk answer, but if you actually know how Michelangelo worked, it's totally true. So this is not Michelangelo. This is our sculptor in his studio. He's carving a block of wood. And this is the typical way you carve a sculpture, in that you have the block and you would sculpt a little on the front, and then you turn that block of wood and you sculpt a little on the side, turn it, sculpt a little on the back, and gradually whittle it down, and then eventually work in the details while turning the whole thing. Michelangelo didn't sculpt that way. He sculpted from the front and he just sculpted straight back, getting it perfect as he worked. No other artist in art history has ever done this, but it was how Michelangelo typically worked. Okay, 400 years later, we're jumping to Paris, France. Now, France is the center of the art world, no longer Italy, but it's in France. And Claude Monet is a young artist, and he's growing up in an industrial Paris. People are leaving the countryside, moving to the cities, machines are being made and created, they're building the Eiffel Tower, and they figure out how to make paint in aluminum tubes. Or metal tubes. Before that, paint was stored, get ready to be grossed out, paint was stored in pig's bladders. And it was the artist's work to create paint every day and then store it in these bladders. And then, I'm not sure how long it lasts in pig's bladders, but eventually you'd have to make more paint and store it in more pig's bladders. Because it's kind of hard to walk around town with a whole bunch of pig's bladders hanging from your belt, artists were tied to the studio. But in the 1860s, 1870s, they start to put paint in tubes. And this is an incredibly freeing time for artists. And we get Impressionism partly as a response to this. Impressionist is not the first start of landscape painting. There was landscape painting before, and this is an example of an earlier landscape painting, but it was highly finished and it was actually looked down on in art. Like, you would be a landscape painter if you couldn't really paint people, you know, like it was like you can't do anything else, you might as well paint landscape. But Monet and his friends came around and they said, no, we're using the new paint. We're going outside. We're doing a painting on location. And then we're going to show that painting. And so when they showed artwork like this one, the public who was used to paintings like this one were like, what is that mess? That's just like an impression. And they said, perfect, we'll call ourselves the Impressionists. Well, that's what we're painting impressions. So their artwork is going to be known for this like crazy radical color. Okay, and then of the group, the Impressionists are a group of guy friends that are all going out and painting. Monet is known as having the best eye. Like he can, we're going to paint next week, so you guys will kind of notice this yourself. We have this idea that like trees are green and the trunk is brown, but that's not really true. If you really look, a tree trunk can be gray, or it could even be yellow in certain light. Monet had this incredibly gift to look at color and not be caught up by what's in his head, but really to see it for what it was. And then an also equally incredible gift of being able to mix that color. So he makes beautiful paintings that are like drenched in sunlight. And he will do a couple series in his life. He's really fascinated by light and the seasons and how it changes. So this is a series of paintings of haystacks in all different lights and all different seasons. I believe the Getty, when it's open, they own one, if not two of these paintings you could see in person. And then he also is interested in the idea of smoke or steam from the railroad. So he starts painting train stations along Paris, although his train stations are far different than ours. They have glass ceilings. But he does a series of paintings just trying to capture steam in an enclosed space and the color of it. And then as he gets older, he can't really go around the countryside painting whatever he wants. So he retires to his house where he builds a lily pond and then does paintings of his lily pond. Now Van Gogh, sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Monet's life, his years, he's born in 1840, and then I think he dies in 1926 or something. So if you think about these years and you think about the world, like he's someone that radically saw France change. It goes from a very like countryside to the city, and then eventually to World War I. World War I is a big time for artists, like not a big time, that's wrong, is a devastating time for artists, because with industrialization, a lot of people had the idea that we were becoming better as a society. And then we had a war when so many people were killed and slaughtered by these machines that were supposed to make things better. So at this very bleak time, Monet does a whole series of these huge, large panels of his water lily pond, which he knows he's about to die, and he leaves them to the French people. Okay, our last artist is Vincent Van Gogh, and now I really have to hold myself back to going on and on and on about Vincent Van Gogh. Vincent Van Gogh is one of our most famous artists in art history. Holding myself back. Okay, Vincent Van Gogh has a really tragic life. There's many movies made about Vincent Van Gogh, so I highly suggest you watch some of those movies. Probably my favorite one is Power of Art by Simon Schama. He has different episodes of different artists, and the one on Van Gogh is really good. Okay, but what you need to know is Van Gogh comes to art kind of late in his life. He first works like as a young person. He gets a job at his uncle's gallery, but Van Gogh has very strong opinions, and it's going to mess him up for his whole life. So he gets a job at an art gallery, but then he gets fired because he's telling customers that the work is terrible and They shouldn't buy they shouldn't buy it. So his uncle has to kind of fire him because he's supposed to be selling the work, not saying it's terrible. So then he gets a work as a pastor, but he's fired from that because of excessive zeal. From the parishioners say, "We don't want you as our pastor. You're crazy. You're too over the top." So then he says, "Well, I think I'm going to go to art school." So he convinces his brother Theo to send him to art school and to pay all his bills. You might want to work on this with your own family. But the advantage for Van Gogh is that Theo has his own art gallery. This is the family business, is owning an art gallery, and now Theo owns one in Paris. And so he says, "Okay, Vincent, I will pay all your bills, but you are going to do the paintings, and then you'll send me the paintings, and I will sell the paintings, and then I'll like send you some of the money and keep some of the money," right? It sounds like a perfect idea in theory, doesn't work out so perfect. This is one of the first paintings that comes from this partnership. Van Gogh does it in 1885. And he's totally impressed with himself. Vincent, he's like, "I did this painting. I think it's really meaningful. It's of poor people. It's called the Potato Eaters. It's of potato eaters sitting around their table, eating their food with the same hands that dug the potatoes." And Theo says, "I hate it. There's no way I can sell this like brown green painting." Theo is in Paris. It's the height of Impressionism. He's selling like Monets, and he's like, "Vincent, no one wants a brown painting. You need to come to Paris." So Vincent comes to Paris, lives with Theo, and he starts doing learning from the Impressionists, hanging out in the places they're hanging out in, painting with them. And so his color palette dramatically expands. But Vincent, again, he has really strong opinions. He's never going to fit in with a crowd. So he says, "I'm going to move away. I want to move to the south of France." Theo says, "Okay, I'll still support you." So Vincent moves to a town named Arles in the south of France, where he really loves the light. And he has this idea that he's going to start like his own colony of artists. And there's going to be like this hot spot for all artists. They're going to move from Paris to his place in Arles. But that never really happens. But he starts making these amazing paintings that have to do with color and that have to do with light. And he's really interested in the idea of complementary contrasts, or that idea of colors on the opposite side of the color wheel and how they affect each other. So he does a painting of a bar room where he talks about how he uses these like blood red colors with these like sickly yellows to try to talk about the feelings of that place. So he's using color in a way to communicate, to give us an atmosphere and communicate his feelings about the place. I should also mention, like, again, trying to keep this short. With Van Gogh, we have a real advantage because since his brother was supporting him, he would write his brother letters, and because he was famously lonely, he would write his brother letters every day. So and then his brothers kept these letters, and now we have them. So we have kind of an autobiography written by Van Gogh about himself. Okay, but things don't go as expected. He actually, he begs his brother Theo to not only pay for himself, but to pay for other artists to come join him. He still has that idea. And eventually, Theo is able to convince Gauguin, Paul Gauguin, an artist, to come move in with Vincent. The deal is Theo will also be paying Gauguin's bills, but that's like the worst roommate situation ever. And it quickly falls apart. Vincent ends up cutting off his ear. We know that, but did you know? Then he puts the ear in an envelope and hands it to his favorite prostitute as some kind of wonderful love token. he's hospitalized after that. And he will sadly spend the rest of his life, which is actually only 2 years, going in and out of hospitals. Van Gogh is such an interesting person because he has this really dramatic, crazy life story that we don't really understand. Again, in these letters, he talks about fits. Another fit is coming. The last fit wasn't so bad after all. And now we look at these letters and we try to figure out, what is he talking about? What's a fit? And so there's some idea that maybe he was schizophrenic, maybe he had epilepsy, maybe he had major depression, or maybe he had all of these things. But for whatever reason, there was some kind of mental imbalance going on with him. But at the same time, when he had this mental imbalance, he's also making amazing, famous paintings. So this is probably, is this his most famous image? Starry Night, irises. This is the I was going to say the Van Gogh. The Getty Museum owns this painting. So when it opens up, you could go see this painting as well. And he made all these paintings when he was in the mental asylum. After cutting off his ear, he checked himself into a mental asylum. And this is my favorite painting of Van Gogh. I think Van Gogh is at his strongest when he lets loose with color and just freely interprets color. So we're all used to like a blue sky, but here he has this like crazy yellow sky going to orange, going to green at the top with these dark trees. And so a Van Gogh painting will always have amazing color and then also amazing brushstrokes. He's doing these paintings incredibly fast. He's working a day or 2 days at the most on making a whole painting. And they're large paintings too. They're not like little tiny small paintings. These are big paintings. Okay, this is his most famous, no, that's not, I said that about the last one. This is one of his famous paintings. This is his last painting he does. He has a suspicious death. He dies from a gunshot wound. That's usually assumed to be suicide, just given his like mental state and what's gone on before him. But there's some thinking that it was actually maybe a gunshot wound from some kids playing in the field. But this is the last painting he's done. And because it comes right before the suicide, it's kind of, I don't know if this will make sense. It's kind of read almost as a suicide note with those dark crows flying across or something. Van Gogh is then buried. He gets the gunshot wound in the stomach. Theo comes. At first, Theo thinks he's going to live, but he doesn't end up living and he dies. And then Theo dies 6 months later. And they're buried together in France. Oh, maybe not France. In Holland. Yeah. Okay. Again, Van Gogh's a really interesting guy. There's different collections of his letters, and then there's always really good films to watch about him. Okay. Thanks, you guys.